Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of GMIS 2020 digital series. My name is Bashar El-Jauhari. I will be your moderator today, and we will be discussing the journey from globalization to glocalization. I'm honored to introduce a distinguished panel of experienced professionals to discuss one of the recent industry trends. It is unfolding as a result of the COVID pandemics. And in our discussion, we will be covering two main points. One, by region or by country, what has been the view on glocalization? And the other one would be, what are some of the drivers or criteria behind that approach or the change that we are seeing? And is it mainly driven by cost, risk, local capabilities, etc., and so on? In order to answer these two questions and discuss them, I would like to introduce my guests. Brett is our US-based strategy and operations partner. He uses his deep supply chain experience across strategy, operations, and technology to develop programmatic supply chain solutions for our clients. His experience spans from the strategic supply chain initiatives to driving revenue growth to operational improvements that significantly reduce operating costs for clients. Having led numerous global teams across 10 countries, Brett understands the uniqueness of the regional challenges and opportunities in the global supply chain. Welcome to the talk, Brett. Cara Haffey is from the other side of the Atlantic. She is with us. She's the leader for the manufacturing and automotive practice at PwC. She is a deals partner and works with corporate and private sector clients on their strategy, implementation, acquisitions, and operational resilience and improvement. Cara is a chartered accountant and has been with PwC for almost 20 years. Again, Cara, welcome to the talk. Another distinguished guest is Dr. Michael Wagner, joining us from Germany. He's one of our partners at Strategy and the strategic arm of PwC. He is an advisor to executives in the industrials and technology sector in Germany. As the EMEA leader of Strategy and's transformation platform called Fit for Growth, he helps his clients strengthen their capabilities, transform their cost structure, and align their organizations to achieve fundamental performance improvements and unlock their profitable growth. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Shashank Tripathi is one of our most experienced partners. He has probably been the longest with the firm. He's a partner in the government strategy and transformation and the leader of aerospace and defense practice in our PwC India. His experience spans over 30 years. His key expertise is in the area of aerospace and defense strategy, public policy design, growth strategy, government and public sector transformation. With that, I would also like to welcome you on to the talk. Coming from the Hong Kong and China mainland, Jan Nicholas is joining us. He leads our operations consulting team, has over 20 years of experience driving operations transformation, process and technology development, strategy development, and supply chain management. His international experience actually includes almost all of the countries within Asia, not to name all of them, and it expands to Mexico and elsewhere. Welcome to the talk. And let's move to our main topics of the day. So Dr. Michael, I will start with you. If we look at Germany in particular, what has been the view on glocalization, and what do you think the country has done or how it's approaching it? If you wouldn't mind starting us.
Yeah, thank you, Bashar. Yeah, happy to actually. Well, you know, first of all, rethinking the global supply chain is on top of the agenda of executives in Germany. We've seen this in our most recent surveys that the majority of German companies said they are working on their supply chain, distribution, and operation strategies as a result of COVID-19. And I thought it was interesting to see that this positive response rate from German companies was higher than the global average of our global survey. And I think this doesn't come as a surprise. German industrial manufacturing companies have really grown their business with globalization in the past, right? So where are we? They have a very global customer and demand base. They have a very global supply base for many reasons. And well, yet we must acknowledge COVID-19 was a shock and has uncovered an insufficient resiliency and has disrupted industrial supply chains. For so many years, companies have optimized fixed manufacturing networks. And so for German companies, it's now the right time to bring efficiency and scale on the one hand and flexibility and robustness on the other hand into balance. So what is the answer? Well, given the positioning of German industrials, which I outlined, we do not expect that we will roll back globalization. Also, we've seen that international companies have been, in many cases, more robust during the crisis. So in Germany, we are indeed seeing a transition to what we here call glocalisation, a shift to a way more flexible global manufacturing footprint with global planning. And we are expecting that the physical value chains will become more localized within a regional setup. And this robust supply chain setup, we believe, goes beyond the location. What we are seeing in Germany is that many industrial companies will, for example, deploy multi-sourcing strategies going forward, will move towards a more flexible supplier footprint, and will maintain or even accelerate investments in digital technologies, which is an interesting aspect. And I am happy to dive deeper into that later. If I may, I would briefly like to highlight another aspect, which I believe is important to understand where industrial firms are heading in Germany. We must acknowledge so many manufacturing and industrial firms have historically a grown legacy in their footprint. So even before COVID-19 hit, we have seen a wave of footprint optimization and consolidation efforts with our clients here to right-size capacities and to reset the network for future demands. So we see this crisis really as an accelerator. Companies are now executing footprint decisions that have possibly been long debated before. And indeed, now is the time to act. I think we agree on that. If we look back at previous crises, we see it was those companies who took decisive, bold, and informed decisions that not only mastered the crisis, but really emerged stronger with a competitive advantage. And I believe this is an important aspect in the discussion. And again, today, this is good advice for our manufacturing industrial clients in Germany.
Thank you for that. Actually, I will pass that to Shashank. Shashank, the Prime Minister, one of his main agendas was the theme of Made in India in particular. How does that fit now in this shift if we are moving from globalization to glocalization or even localization? Would you like to highlight some of the key points?
So I would say that I want to frame that answer in three levels. One is India as a large democracy and a large country is reshaping its own image for the Western world and the Eastern world to be a fairly big market, which is also an important element of anyone looking at global supply chain rearrangements. The second is that there is a lot of excitement and there's a lot of interest in India from a supply chain perspective, which is globally because of Atmanirbhar, which is a new version of Make in India, which was announced just recently as part of a stimulus package. But I think the more important point is also that because India is a deep and wide nation, there's also hyper-local supply chains which are also coming along. So when we talk about any kind of supply chain rearrangements, I think it's driven by those three parameters: a global shift in the dynamics of nations, a global shift in supply chains, which is more operational, and a more hyper-local shift in supply chains. And alongside all of this, there is a fairly strong push for digital. So if you look at it in those three or four buckets, then I think we are really rising to the challenge, because while India may not be a big manufacturing power, we have a fairly strong point of view on digital. We are known as a digital nation. It is also probably fair, as we have pointed out in a recent report that I authored, Full Potential Revival and Growth, that the digital aspect has not been so much utilized inside the country as it has been utilized outside. We are seen as an exporting nation for digital. It's about time that we focused also internally on the 1.35 billion people who, by the way, are quite well equipped right now, because for the last 10 years, we've built up many stacks, digital stacks. So my summary would be that the Make in India campaign that the Prime Minister unleashed about 4 years back has come back with a vengeance. Our point of view in this Full Potential Revival and Growth is that India should see this crisis as a crisis which we have to cope with, but also as an opportunity, because here's an opportunity to make some bolder decisions, some transformative decisions, which as a democracy we often find hard to execute because there's a lot of consensus building, and there's nothing better than a crisis to build consensus.
Expedited, agree. Brett, we know about some of the friction that's happened in the recent months and year and so on between the US and China, and there's a lot of imports from China, or a supply base for the US and China. How do you see the shift now again from this globalization to glocalization in the US or in North America?
Yeah, definitely. Historically, the U.S. has primarily, and there's many other factors, but the primary factor when looking at manufacturing and sourcing decisions has been a look at the total landed cost, right? So looking at your different options and adding up what's the labor cost, what's the material cost, your logistics cost, your inventory cost, so on and so forth. And those things, when you add them all up and compare the scenarios, end up placing a large importance on low-cost labor. And as we look at that, that naturally has driven us to having a large reliance on Mexico and China with great skill sets and abundance of labor there. It's made a lot of sense. But what we're seeing now is kind of two factors emerging. One is those input costs in that total cost model have changed significantly, right? So the labor rates have gone up. The logistics costs are higher than what anybody ever imagined they originally would be, so on and so forth. The duties obviously are a big factor as well. But in addition to that, people are starting to think more about other factors that aren't in the quote-unquote total cost model, starting to look more at the areas of resiliency and flexibility, as well as looking more at your customer market and figuring out how to be able to provide a better experience for your customers. And so when you combine the changes on the quote-unquote total cost model, plus the desire to be more resilient, plus the desire to be more flexible and to be able to service your customers better, we're seeing a pull to moving the supply chains, whether it be manufacturing or your suppliers, closer to the point of use. And so what we envision that we're going to continue to see is more moves into areas like Mexico, or dual strategies with things like in the U.S. and in Mexico, or Mexico and another low-cost country in Asia.
Oh, thank you for that. And actually, John, since you are in Hong Kong and in China, and it's probably one of the places where we have seen either the impact of the friction, or even we have seen the pandemic, where Japan is now thinking of investing almost $1 trillion to diversify its supply base, some of it away from China, just because of the pandemic, not just political. How do you see that? What is the impact? Has there been between globalization and glocalization in China and Hong Kong?
Well, as you said rightly, we here in Greater China and also in Southeast Asia, we really are at the center of the current realignment. And I'll echo what Brett said earlier. This is an acceleration of existing trends. So China began expanding the footprint of Chinese companies into Southeast Asia, South Asia, even East Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative long before COVID happened. And that the growth of the Chinese economy has lifted the living standards in China, but has created wage inflation that have made it less attractive to be in the coastal areas. And so we've seen a diversification of manufacturing footprint more towards inland China and also into Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So that was a trend that was already existing. And some of this is very industry specific as well. So when you think about glocalization, there are some companies that source mainly from China, and we're seeing diversification in sources of supply for them. That, as Brett said, they may opt for Southeast Asia or South Asia or elsewhere. There are a lot of companies that see China as an attractive market and pursue a China for China strategy. So when we think about glocalization, a piece of that is how do we satisfy demand in a large, attractive market like China? How do we also satisfy demand elsewhere in the world? And how do we balance the needs of two major superpowers who have different views on how they might interact without offending either party? And I think that's part of the challenge that a lot of multinationals are working through right now.
Cara, you are in the UK. We all know about the Brexit and its potential impact. But how do you see that in the light of the shift from also the pandemic coming as a compounded, maybe the effect of shifting from globalization to glocalization? And was there anything you have seen or trends in the UK?
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you certainly mentioned we have a B word as well as a C word. So we've COVID-19 and also Brexit. So I think from our point of view, our industrial and manufacturing companies, I suppose, had the added benefit as COVID-19 hit that they had spent the year before looking at their supply chains because of the impending Brexit piece and how they kind of needed also to look at that. So, you know, I've certainly heard some of my clients talking about that, you know, they kind of understood their supply chain to a level that they hadn't, and at least they had that kind of understanding. I think the UK has certainly embraced globalization, and London obviously sees itself as a very global city and a very open economy. And, you know, I therefore think COVID-19 hit really hard. You know, people actually therefore felt like actually we don't have what we potentially used to have in terms of some of the key components for, you know, making medical equipment. And you know, there's certainly been a lot at the political levels about, you know, what do we need to still have on shore. And that certainly started a huge debate, to go back to some of the other guests here, about kind of resilience and how do you make sure you've got some of that. You don't need all the capability, but how do you have at least, you know, a manufacturer left on shore that could do this? And that's been a huge piece of a talking point. Now, obviously, at the height of the pandemic in the UK, there was a lot of talk about, right, this is all going to go back to local. And it's very interesting because some of the manufacturing associations were saying, hold on a second, it takes a long time to change a supply chain. You know, this is not something that suddenly you can kind of change overnight. So let's be very kind of thoughtful and sensible about it. What I have also, I suppose, seen is very much, you know, the cost element. As Brett was talking about, cost has been such a focus of supply chain as people plan for it. And I have, you know, genuinely seen a very different discussion as that broadens to sustainability, to climate change, to kind of cost as part of that, but also how do you cope with some of the things that people just never thought they would have to cope with in terms of, you know, the disruption. So I certainly think there's a wider debate to be had, and in each company that I'm talking to, that debate is ongoing. And actually some multinationals are rethinking some strategies they were already implementing to say, right, hold on a second, you know, let's just actually think this through now that we have lived through the whole of 2020 so far. So, you know, very much a kind of thoughtful and acting now to recover and restructure well is what is the focus of many boards.
Excellent. I actually want to comment on one thing that Shashank mentioned about, which is interesting, is how decisions are being accelerated now with the pandemic. It's almost like a catalyst. And you see now a trend more, even in our region here in the Middle East, towards digitization. And now governments are paying closer attention to it. But also, I like what you mentioned, Cara, about resilience or sustainability. And one thing that's unique about our region, probably all of you know, is that spare parts for utilities, if they stop coming, we don't have water to drink. So it's a life-threatening situation. It's a little bit even different than, it's not a luxury of saying, I need to have that to have sustainability in my economy or in my... The other thing we have discovered is that the pandemic also showed while there have been localization programs in place, it has been mostly driven by the energy sector. So when it came to healthcare, as an example, then they discovered, okay, we have shortages in pharmaceuticals, protective gear, some of the other elements that you will need, critical elements within healthcare. And that became another important point. The third point that became also critical in our region is food security. It doesn't matter if I have the money to buy, can I get what I'm buying here? And that's where they started thinking a little bit differently about how I can diversify my sources. I think something Michael touched on. How can I speed up my digital applications so I can have better forecasting and better scenario testing and so on, and so and the alike. So with that, as we also see this shift or the trend and so on, what were some, I think some of you have touched on some of the drivers for the shift within your country or companies and so on, but can we talk some more about that? I think, for example, Brett talked about cost initially as was the main driver for globalization, but now there are different reasons for why you're approaching it. Would you like to touch base some more into what are some of the criteria or enablers or drivers that governments will have to follow or companies to make it happen?
I think in a positive way, sorry.
Yeah.
I think in a positive way, Bashar, I think what we have seen is that some of the companies, to mirror what Shashank said about India, you know, some companies have actually found that if they'd had a more agile facility, they could have sold more in a market. So we think this in a positive way, actually, if they'd been closer to that market and had a more agile operation spanning more of the globe rather than, you know, a huge factory, and if I take it as an extreme, a huge factory in one location. So I think people have seen the positive element of actually, if I'd had that, I could have sold more. So I think that's a very interesting perspective rather than just looking at the cost perspective and actually looking at the markets and looking at the size of the markets for local.
So are you talking more about diversifying their footprint even of factories rather than having big ones, maybe smaller flexible ones? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, and certainly I've heard that a lot more. It's not, you know, it's not in every conversation, but I've heard that a lot more over the last 6 months than I'd heard in the last 5 years before that. About, I think people presumed that they could travel and kind of get their goods there quickly, whereas actually being in country at some points during the last 6 months mattered a lot more, and therefore I think that's made people thoughtful about actually the positive, what could have driven revenue, as well as actually what they negatively feel they missed out on now in terms of opportunities to supply.
Dr. Michael, I think you also wanted to mention something.
Yeah, I'm happy to, Bashar. I think, you know, my colleagues put it nicely that, you know, traditionally companies have come from a total cost perspective, right? Looking at scale, looking at efficiency. We're now balancing this with flexibility, robustness to generate true resiliency in the supply chain. But I believe, you know, the ultimate goal will be to design the best future supply chain setup for the specific business portfolio and for their strategies to help companies improve customer experience and gain an advantage, right? I mean, let's not forget about supply chain really being a great enabler for profitable growth of companies. And of course, things are more complex in reality. Cara, you touched upon sustainability, which is for sure important criteria for German companies. And also we see that considerations around localization currently are maybe more driven by geopolitical concerns like tariffs, even more than by COVID-19 implications in Germany. I mean, there's a couple of factors that play into the discussion currently about the future footprints.
Yeah.
Shashank, you wanted to make a comment?
I was about to I was thinking as we spoke and we are discussing that I think one of the key intellectual drivers is that when there is some scarcity, you look at the same thing with a different lens. And I think this time, what we found that data has been looked at with a different lens. And I want to just build on that a bit more. So the supply chain rearrangements has a very strong relationship with data, which we knew forever, but nobody really paid attention to it. Now people are saying that data is the new mantra, which will make it more efficient. Given the fact that we cannot do a lot of rearrangements, how do you link up supply chains without with data? And here I think the whole analogy of data as oil is falling down. Data is more like water. If you keep the river clean and you let the water flow from, let's say, one country to the other or one company to the other, then you are able to make sure that it is unpolluted. It is something which is seen as a joint resource, not owned by one country or the other or one company or the other. So I think that's an area which we should explore a lot more. And I'm suggesting this is not a done deal, which is how do we make sure that supply chain rearrangements have a very big bearing on data as an asset, but not asset which is something for me or you to keep, because oil is owned by an oil company which extracts it. Here it's almost like water, which is, and I started my career at Schlumberger many years back, but I think here it's more about water. How do you make sure that you take from one country to the other and make sure you tend to the banks of the river so you can clean, you protect it. And then when it goes into the field, it fertilizes everything. So that's an analogy that I think we should build upon jointly.
Thank you. Brett, it seems you're in agreement. Would you like to comment or add?
Oh, no, I agree completely. I think when we're looking at these decisions, our clients are looking at them now. Some of the other things that Shashank was mentioning, I think it's becoming more and more important, is the digital look at it, right? And the question that we're having with clients over and over again that regularly starts with a discussion on footprint, often, almost always, moves into digitization and automation. And how do we think about the future of the supply chain? We're going to go rebuild this, and we're going to look at moving manufacturing. Are we able to actually change some of the dynamics of those cost curves by looking at more automation, smart factories, so on and so forth? And what we're seeing is that we can actually then make that shift, so that digitization is allowing us to go more local by taking labor out of the actual equation and creating a more competitive environment by replacing people with information.
John, what do you think?
So I agree with all that. One thing that I found fascinating through all of this is the acceleration of digitization and people finding solutions that they otherwise wouldn't have employed. They knew these solutions were there. They had seen them in the market, but they didn't really have the incentive to innovate around those solutions and create exactly what we're doing right now. This would not have occurred a year ago without the forcing function of the pandemic. And the other forcing function that we're seeing is around the geopolitics. And what I'm seeing very interestingly, especially here in Greater China, is that cost used to be the primary discussion point for these conversations. And cost has shifted from being a driver of the conversation to being a boundary condition. People are now responding to the trade tensions. In the beginning, tariffs were driving a lot of the movement, but now it's actually geopolitics, and it's people trying to de-risk geopolitics. And instead of starting with cost and saying, how do I reduce cost? What they're saying is, I need to fix this problem, and I cannot create a cost problem while I do it. And so this is happening on both sides. Companies are very nervous about the potential fallout from the trade tensions. Western MNCs are equally cautious of both sides. They don't want to create disfavor on either side of the Pacific, and they need to de-risk their footprint as they do it. And Chinese companies they're appropriately concerned over what might happen with the United States right now, because the United States is very unpredictable. So this level of nervousness and this level of uncertainty in the market is creating a fantastic opportunity for companies to transform, because it opens the possibilities for them to break things that they couldn't break before. And so the rules have been set aside somewhat. There's still boundary conditions. Nobody's going to accept a step change in cost in order to do this, but they're being much more flexible in how they think about their problems. And so I think we have a window of opportunity for the near term where companies can think very innovatively, and investors and stakeholders will reward them for that, rather than shifting back into a mindset of steady state cost reduction. And I think that's very exciting for supply chain professionals.
Actually, if we look at our region here in the Middle East, there was a lot of focus in recent years on localization, which slightly started to shift. And the main driver, if you think about it, is the dependency on oil. So countries want to diversify away from just purely depending on the energy sector or the oil and gas sector. The other thing is the amount of youthfulness. We have, if we pick Saudi as an example, almost 2/3 of the population under 30 years old. We have to create jobs for that young population. It's educated population, and they have a lot of access at the moment to what's happening around the globe. So that's another how you create jobs for such young population. But they also started to realize that I can't do it all by myself. So now they are looking into how can I attract the alike of GE or the alike of Siemens or any of the other companies that we know around the world to say, can you really establish facilities here and from here serve the rest of the world or the region? And the idea is really, again, shifting from pure thinking of localization to glocalization in a way where I can have a footprint of an international company in my own territory or in my own area to really serve and produce. And I think that is one of the main dynamics. So it's really brought a different reasoning for why to expedite the process. So this is really from our regional perspective as well, and how that's happening. Any particular point
Sure,
you would like to add to the discussion?
Can I just add one thing? And I just want to maybe strike a slightly contrarian note. No good panel discussion is, how shall I say, full without that. See, my view is that we need to think about localization and supply chains as a two-tone effort. So while I appreciate that there is a fairly strong effort within India in the Internet of Things, as an example, right? How do we connect machines to machines? But we also have to realize that revival in many of these countries will be because of what you just said about employment. And even for us here in India, there is going to be a two-tone recovery. No doubt automation will create a lot of recovery and economic value. But simply putting people from agriculture into simple manufacturing will also create a heck of a lot of productivity. So what I would argue is that as we think about the localization journey and the supply chains, we may come into a country as large as India and say that we will do it. And I was arguing earlier about digitization myself, right? But I think at some point in time, there is a human element to this. And I think we need to recognize that. And we can also say that if 1.35 billion people have been in lockdown for 6 weeks, it has impacted everyone, right? That has taken also a psychological toll on everyone in the planet, actually. Mm-hmm. How do we make sure that as we go and revive, we keep that human spirit and human sentiment behind? That is a very critical element of what we need to do going forward. And I think that's especially true in less industrialized countries like India, but I suspect it's true in every country.
Anyone would like to comment on that before I also add to it from my perspective?
Sure, I'll add that I think that's very true. And we're actually seeing it in policy decisions here in China with the central government's dual circulation proposal that that we seek to stimulate domestic consumption. China historically has gotten a lot of acceleration through production for export, and so increasing domestic production, increasing the tailoring of products for the local market, and satisfying local demand. And I think that you'll see more of that. I agree very much that you'll see more of that in different regions and different countries around the world as countries seek to solve some of the economic challenges they've had from the coronavirus in spurring domestic growth. And I think that's very much a trend we'll see in the future.
What I wanted to add maybe to this comment is that it's like computers when they came in the 70s and so on. A lot of people, including accountants and finance people, they thought they will be out of business because computers will take their jobs. In reality, it created different kinds of jobs, actually more jobs. And I think this is one of the things we need to look into, which is really, as some jobs may disappear, many more will be created with the new way of, with the new economy and the new footprint of having a local presence and so on. So what do you think about that? I think, Michael, you wanted to make a comment, so I'll let you maybe add your comments to what Shashank mentioned earlier.
Thanks, Bashar. Yeah, I think, Shashank, you asked about the challenges of implementing what we're discussing here, right? And talked about the human element, Chanyu, as well. I think that's an important factor on a level of a nation, but I would like to ask a similar question on the level of individual companies. Do companies have the right capabilities, the right talent, the right people on board to master this accelerated digitization, this accelerated automation, and to really master globalization? I mean, I think that's an important question our clients and company executives are asking themselves. I can tell you here in the German market, we're currently seeing a huge investment of companies into state-of-the-art planning of demand and supply, of sales and operations. I mean, really to a degree for the first time in 10 years. Yeah? I mean, many companies have the process, have the tools, but they realize they need a behavior change in the organization to really capture the benefits. Yeah? And also data-driven forecasting, AI-based sensing algorithms of demand now can be applied and are applied by companies, but yet are new technologies and require new capabilities and new talent. And it's true also for the automation agenda, where I agree, one of you has outlined this before. This will, for so many reasons, be one of the key capabilities to really master this challenge, because it fosters both efficiency and flexibility. It helps to relocate labor, and it helps to increase the flexibility of the capacity. So many questions I think companies have to solve. Yeah.
I think it's interesting, Michael, what you said, because actually you said, individual and companies, can they solve it by themselves? And actually one of the things to kind of link what Shashank said and yourself is what we did see in the pandemic was actually companies working together at a speed and a collaboration and a creativity that one wouldn't see, unless it was put together by manufacturing associations and governments. And so to go to kind of the human nature of the things that automation can't do, the creativity and collaboration that came in a positive way from crisis, we couldn't have got to. And actually there's been a lot of good things that we need to take from this and not go back to what it was. And as we create jobs and think about how creation can happen, how do we do that in a collaborative way and in a more joint venture way across countries, across corporates? And I'm hopeful that that's something that will be a lesson learned through this, as we have gone back to some of the very, very figurative things about what's very important to us in whenever crisis comes.
Yeah, full agreement with that, Cara. Yeah.
We are coming to the end of our time here for the talk. I would really like to thank all of you for contributing to our discussions. Cara, John, Brett, Shashank, and Michael, thank you very much. To summarize, we have talked today about the shift or the journey from globalization to glocalization by region, what is happening, what is the criteria, the driver, and the forces behind that change, and what can it bring. We have talked about moving from just thinking about cost to flexibility and agility, sustainability, expediting the digitization journey, the faster decision-making process, the collective effort. I think Cara's final point, that the companies are coming together to make it happen. Actually, even communities coming together to make it happen. So I would like to thank you again for your time, and hope to talk to you in a future panels. Continue the conversation on our social media at GMI Summit by using the hashtag GMIS2020. Thank you.